I'm Shirley J. Thompson. I'm a composer, creative director, filmmaker, writer, broadcaster. I do several things to get my work performed. My parents came from Jamaica and I was born here. We lived in the East End of London where I went to school, junior school, secondary school, and then on to university out of London. That was probably the first time that I spent an extended period out of London studying music at actually at Liverpool University. So primarily I grew up very much in a bicultural way as a youngster. So my parents are Jamaican, and I grew up in a Jamaican household, listening to lots of Jamaican music, eating lots of Jamaican food, having lots of Jamaican relatives. So I went to school. At that time, I was the only person of colour in my classroom. So I was totally immersed in an English culture, and at home in Jamaican culture. So I feel that I lived between the two and benefited from the two. Probably up until the age of about 10, I didn't really feel that I was affected by being a person of colour until it came to the time when there was a choice of schools, and all of my friends went to a much better school and I was sent to an awful school, and that's when I began to wonder about discrimination and unfairness within the education system. Well, it was a big shock to me that I was picked out from my friends and sent elsewhere. So I studied music, musicology at the University of Liverpool. I had quite a difficult choice because I was equally good at studying history. So I actually studied modern history and music, musicology, as opposed to performance or composition. It was a rounded, comprehensive course where I could do some composition, but it was just 1% of the course, and I actually wrote music as a hobby, the weekends, and that's how I started to write music. It wasn't actually something I needed to do. So it was always, for me, writing music was always fun. I'd actually started when I was taking my A-levels. My A-level group consisted of a flautist, myself on the violin, and a pianist. I used to write little piano trios for that group that actually got public performances, and I got a taste of what it was like to have an audience respond to your music, but I didn't take it seriously. I thought Beethoven and Bach were composers. I didn't think of myself as a composer. My musical style, I would say, is varied. I was always interested in a lyrical line in my writing for the voice and for instruments. I would say that I started off very much post-secondary in E school. Certainly my first string quartet was very much in the style of Webern, because I remember when friends of mine saw my music in the 90s, when I became much more lyrical, they were very shocked at the way that my music had transformed from Webern, which I studied at Liverpool University, and then post taking my master's degree, which I took at Goldsmiths, when I studied a lot of Eastern European music, so Penderecki, Ligeti, Lutosławski, I was really immersed in the Eastern European style. I thought that I didn't quite fit into this aesthetic, and I wanted to create my own voice. So post my master's degree, which I finished in the mid-80s, I was very conscious that I was just wanting to be myself, and myself is quite melodic and lyrical. I would say the changing point for my work came with a piece called Blue for You, which is for cello and string orchestra, when I was trying to see if I could write an extensive melodic line in a way that Bach does in, say, a Bach unaccompanied sonata. So that was a test piece, and although I've never really returned to that kind of melodic way of writing, there are fragments of this in my orchestral or operatic and other works. So as well as looking at the melodic, the top line and melody within multi-textures with which I work, I work polyphonically, I'm probably a mixture of minimalism and post kind of serialism, and I'm very much interested in popular music and world music. So I aspire to include, say, reggae in my work and soul, R&B, hip hop. I'm very much interested in contemporary styles, and I'm also very interested in the spoken word, and the spoken word used in a way that's speaking about what's happening currently in terms of social justice and in terms of political affairs, as well as historical affairs. And I find that using the spoken word can convey certain things more directly than can some instrumental or vocal music. I've written a series of operas called Heroines of Opera, and that all started, the initiative started with me trying to uncover iconic figures from history who have not been featured in mainstream history. The commission started with my being commissioned to write a piece for the 250-year anniversary of the abolition of the trade in enslaved African people. And so for that, I chose three women, three iconic women from three different continents involved in the trade of enslaved people from Africa, who were taken via Britain, the UK, to the Caribbean and to the Americas. So it started with three women, one of them being the woman who refused to dance on the slave boat of Captain Kimber, Dido Elizabeth Bell, who represented the British-English part of the trilogy, and then Sacred Mountain, the Queen Annie of the Maroons, who represented the Caribbean and Americas in terms of her contribution to that particular trilogy. But from that trilogy, I've continued with this idea of heroines of opera and women featured in history. So my latest work is actually looking at the Windrush women. So it's called Women of the Windrush Tell Their Stories. And it's vignettes of women coming from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s, and the way that they had to find themselves, work out how to live in a new land. I chose four women for a film to create an interesting story. So the four women I chose in terms of occupation were a nurse, a cricketer's wife, so she toured a lot, a concert pianist, and a young bride. That forms the backdrop to the opera. And then I have vignettes of their lives as they're going to church, as they're trying to find work, as they're going out to get bread, as they're having children. I really try to create a picture of what it was like to migrate from the Caribbean, and the Americas in the 50s, 60s, and come to England, which at the time was post-war and quite a broken country, and how they contributed significantly to the way we see England and Europe now. I might describe my identity as, first of all, a Londoner, a woman, an academic, a musician, a composer, a creative director, an entrepreneur, a traveller, a historian, a storyteller, love sports, love tennis, love exploring countrysides, love lots of things. Okay, how might I describe my compositional aesthetic? First and foremost, I try to represent what I'm writing about. For example, I write a lot about historical incidents or political incidents, narratively or sometimes abstractly. My main intention is that I communicate to an audience. So I'm very interested in audience engagement, and I try to find a language which I think is quite universal, and that on the first hearing, as we don't often, someone might not get a second performance, but I'd like on a first hearing that the piece have an impact. So my music might be quite dramatic. I think it's quite direct and clear. So in terms of my works that I'm most proud of, I've mentioned a few. I wrote, co-scored the ballet Push, which toured for 10 years to 45 countries worldwide. And I'm very proud that that work reached to all corners of the globe, the Middle East, Australia, all over Europe, all over America, and came to the main opera houses here, so the Royal Opera House, the Coliseum, Sadler's Wells. So I'm very proud that not only musicians and music lovers saw that work, but a much broader audience, and that's my intention when I'm writing music, that an extensive audience that would not normally go to concerts will listen to my music, and I really like that. The other work that I think has reached quite a distance is my symphony. It's a 5-movement symphony, really created around the idea of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and it's in 5 movements, and it tells the story of London in 5 chapters. I wrote it for the Queen's Jubilee in 2002. I actually finished it, although some of the movements were ready for the Jubilee, I finished it in 2003 in its entirety, and it was recorded by the Royal Philharmonic with soloists and choirs, actually a work for 200 people. Other works include my Heroines of Opera series, which I'm very proud of, and works that I wrote for my ensemble through the 90s when I really tested my musical aesthetic by mixing improvisation with post-Webern type of music, and also with rap music and hip-hop, soul, reggae. So I was really fusing in popular music elements as well as world music, because I'm a big fan of Fela Kuti, Salif Keita, and those kinds of musicians. In terms of my musical output, I would say, because I've been immersed in so many different cultures, so very much the Western European school canon of orchestral music, blue beat and ska and reggae and soul from the vernacular. I really do feel that I can draw on many, many things. Film music. In fact, I started off writing, as a professional, I started off writing music for television and won awards for that, actually. So certainly as a musician, I felt it. As a trained musician, I felt I ought to be able to write for all these different genres and forms, and I've certainly written for a few different genres and forms because of my technical training at university, both doing my master's degree, PhD, and then previous to that a bachelor's degree. But in terms of finding my way, I do think I needed to do that for myself, because the climate I was writing in during the 80s, 90s, the first 10 years of the 21st century was very much about being very complex and abstract, whereas I was very interested in being direct. I was very interested in a narrative that would communicate. So I had to find that for myself. I can't think of many people that were interested in doing that or thought of doing that. I think there are a lot of people doing that now. I've noticed that the last 5 years, maybe with the next generation, they're very much interested in social issues, social justice and affairs. But certainly working through the 80s, 90s and first 10 years of the 21st century, I don't feel that the classical music, well, were particularly interested in those kinds of issues. Without being conscious of it, I've probably always worked in a culturally diverse fashion because of coming from a culturally diverse background. I've been conscious that the main wave of classical music has been Eastern European or Western European, and I'm not sure of the influence from Africa and the Caribbean within that. I've latterly come across many American composers, African American composers, who have been great innovators in classical music, but have not necessarily been acknowledged. And certainly from the time of Saint-Georges, who's a great innovator, there has been a contribution by composers of African descent. When I came onto the classical music scene in the mid-80s, the only composer of colour that I was aware of was Samuel Coleridge Taylor. That's the only person I'd vaguely come across, and William Grant Still. I'd come across them at the Victoria Music Library, and was very surprised to find them and actually delighted. There were many initiatives through the 80s to increase, well, not many initiatives. I was certainly involved in one initiative in the 80s to increase cultural diversity in classical music. The GLC at the time staged a very big concert that I led artistically called Visions. It was also backed up by the Black Cultural Archives, and it showed the huge amount of diversity and persons from Africa and the Caribbean who were working in the classical music industry. That was in the mid-80s. There haven't been many initiatives since then. I set up my own orchestra, or my own ensemble, in the early 90s, and that's the nearest I got to really working with a culturally diverse ensemble and performing culturally diverse music as I would see it. In the mid-90s, Bernie Grant MP had a panel of musicians and artists who were very concerned that there were actually no musicians being acknowledged in the major prizes and in the major festivals during the 90s. For example, the Brit Awards, I don't think there was one person of colour that was even nominated, and certainly no person of colour was won. So the issues of cultural diversity have really been pervasive. Various people have taken the initiative to set up, to examine what the case is. Of course, this year we've seen Stormzy win a Brit Award, or was it last year? So things have changed, certainly in the popular music field. I don't think they've changed significantly, but there are changes, and certainly people of colour should be acknowledged, certainly in the popular music field, because popular music comes out of the African experience and the American experience from blues, which comes from the enslaved African experience. So I would expect popular music, persons of colour, to gain recognition within popular music. What hasn't been known is the influence on the innovation of African people within classical music, and that's something that I've been working on from a theoretical point of view and a research point of view, as well as in my own work, investing musical ideas that are references to my heritage, as well as more works that are in the narrative that speak of histories from Africa and from the Caribbean and from the Black British experience. In the 90s, I was asked by Bernie Grant to join a committee looking at the lack of diversity, cultural diversity within musics of all kinds, so popular music and classical music, because he had noticed that in the Brit Awards there were no persons of colour nominated in the awards or that won. He called a number of us into Parliament, into the House of Commons, and we met regularly over the course of about 6 years, well, up until he sadly passed, to look at ways in which we could increase diversity in all kinds of music, all kinds of musical styles. One suggestion I made was that we needed a platform, such as a building that housed and could showcase music from around the world. And we now have the Bernie Grant Arts Centre as a result of my suggestion that we needed an arts centre. And I think having a building that represents cultural diversity certainly is one way forward. Certainly we have the building, but we need it in the software, in the music itself, and in the stage works, and so on. So I saw it as my duty to continue to write, because unless you've got the works to show, then you don't have very much evidence of cultural diversity. Do I feel pigeonholed for being a person of colour and a woman? No. I went through my whole schooling, education, certainly studying composition as I did at master's and PhD level, entirely with men and white men. So no, I never felt pigeonholed, because I wasn't pigeonholed in that environment. After leaving higher education, I forged my own way and created my own voice. I could have tried to emulate the styles that were current, but I had no interest in that. I was very interested in developing my own voice, which is a voice from somebody that's of a Jamaican heritage, of a London heritage, of a British heritage, that listens to lots and lots of different kinds of music, including contemporary classical music. I've not felt pigeonholed, and I don't think I've put myself into a corner either. It's not my interest. It's difficult to describe the pieces, the one piece that I would select for a listener to introduce my musical style to them, because in my early part of my writing, I was very much post-Faber, post-Second Viennese School, and then there was a sudden swing towards something that was much more lyrical. So two words that might embody that range might be a trilogy for soprano called Spirit Songs, and also my symphony, New Nation Rising, A London Story, because it actually goes through a range of styles. I use what I call a very direct voice in that, and a universal voice, and I also use a lot of quotations from Beethoven, from Gracie Fields was one of Wars too. So I use a lot of techniques through that piece, which quite filmic techniques actually, as you might perceive them, to tell a story of London, and that also depict, I would say, or encapsulate a range of my styles.